prestigious White Star Line. She was built in Ireland, in what was then the world's largest shipyard, Harland and Wolff's of Belfast. Preparations for her construction had begun as early as 1907. Men and horses toiled in the mud of Queen's Island to prepare two giant slipways, big enough to build the largest liners the world had ever seen. The White Star Line had commissioned the yard to build three sister ships, Olympic, Titanic and Britannic. They were to sail the transatlantic route in competition with the fast, turbine-powered ships of the Cunard Line, the Mauretania and the Lusitania. Rather than compete with the speed of their rivals, White Star asked Harland and Wolff's designers for ships that were much more luxurious and 1.5 times larger. The final drawings emerged from the drawing office and were approved in 1908. By this time, the great gantries had been constructed over the new slipways, where the Titanic and Olympic were to be built side by side. At that time, Harland and Wolff employed 15,000 men. 3,000 of them would work on Titanic alone. At the time, the Olympic was the focus of publicity, as she was the first to have her keel laid and the first to be launched. Her sister ship, Titanic, however, would soon eclipse her fame. By April 1910, the frames of Titanic's great hull were complete, while beside her the hull of the Olympic was already plated. Here we see the steel stockyard in the foreground, with the Olympic almost ready for launching and the outer plating of Titanic well advanced. The steel plates and beams on these great ships were not welded together as they would be today. The plates were overlapped, drilled, and fastened by up to 3 million wrought iron rivets, heated white hot and hammered tight. The noise was literally deafening. Most shipyard workers had damaged hearing. In early May of 1911, the tail shafts were fitted and the final preparations made for launching. The timber shores and blocks were removed, and the giant hull was held in place by hydraulic launching triggers. On the 31st of May, Lord Peary, the chairman of Harland and Wolff, made a last inspection with his colleague from the White Star Line. When the tide reached its height at 12:15, with no breaking of champagne or speeches, Peary gave the signal to fire warning rockets. Great hydraulic rams engaged with the massive hulk to overcome her initial inertia. Slowly but inexorably, Titanic starts to glide on rails greased with tons of tallow and soft soap. With the tiny figures of shipyard workers dotted along the rails of her upper decks, the hull gradually picks up speed, all of her 24,360 tons accelerating down the slip in an unstoppable ride. In just 62 seconds, traveling at 12 knots, she plunged into the sea, lurching against the drag of colossal chains laid to restrain her headlong rush. Afloat at last, she is still an empty, powerless hulk, without engines, boilers, or furnishings. Her engines were enormous. Here, the two reciprocating steam engines are seen in the engine shed. In the hull, they were placed side by side, each driving its own shaft and propeller. Steam emerged from these engines at quite a high pressure. This was put through a turbine to increase power without using more fuel. Even with the efficiency of a third propeller driven by the turbine, fuel consumption was enormous. For an Atlantic crossing, the sister ships required 6,000 tons of coal shoveled by hand into 29 boilers. Technically, the Titanic was one of the most advanced ships afloat when the tugs finally nudged her out into Belfast Lock for sea trials. Because of design improvements, she was a little bigger than the Olympic, and therefore the largest ship in the world. The sheer luxury of her fit-out, however, was her most remarkable feature. The first-class accommodation was extraordinarily lavish. It was indeed a key feature in the marketing of the White Star Line. The upper decks accommodated the first and second-class passengers in spacious elegance. The majority of passengers, however, were on the lower decks, travelling third class. Father Frank Brown, who sailed on Titanic from Southampton to Queenstown, photographed some of them watching the tugs nudge the ship away from the wharf as the maiden voyage began. She first sailed to Cherbourg, where she took on more passengers, many of whom were poor emigrants from southern Europe and China. When she arrived in Queenstown, she took on just 3 first-class passengers and 7 second-class, compared to 113 third-class. Most of these were young, single men and women. They were part of the tide of emigrants which had continued to flow out of Ireland since the famine of the 1840s. There were shipping offices all over Ireland selling tickets to generations of young men and women who could see no future for themselves in Ireland. Tens of thousands passed through Queenstown every year. In 1912, 30,000 emigrated from Ireland, 20,000 to the US, and a further 6,000 to Canada. For most of the emigrants on the Titanic, the accommodation was far more luxurious than anything they had ever experienced before. There was a party atmosphere in the third class as she prepared to leave, the sense of adventure heightened by the luxury of their surroundings. The excitement of the moment, however, could not entirely conceal the underlying sadness of this mass leave-taking. With one-way tickets, in search of a better life, the young emigrants were leaving everything they knew behind. On the deck of one of the Queenstown tenders, Father Brown photographed a lone trumpeter saluting the departing emigrants. As the great liner weighed anchor, an uilleann piper played a lament on Titanic's poop deck. Titanic sailed, carrying the dreams of her passengers for a new life in America. She was the very pinnacle of the technology of her time, considered virtually unsinkable. When she struck an iceberg at 11:40 on Sunday the 14th of April 1912, she would become freighted with symbolism in the public imagination, slipping from the mundane world into myth. In the next section of the exhibition, alongside memorabilia of Titanic and the White Star Line, we explore the routine of her visit to Queenstown, the embarkation of passengers, the loading of baggage and mail bags, as she prepared for her first and final Atlantic voyage.